The dark used to be a world. Tonight, when you turn off the light, take a second before you reach for your phone. Your eyes begin to adjust. Shapes come back slowly. The door frame, the edge of the wardrobe, a pale rectangle where the curtain doesn't quite meet the wall. There's the thin orange wash from the street outside. There's a green LED on the smoke detector. There's the faint glow of a city sky that never really goes dark. This is what you call darkness. You're probably not alone in that. Most people alive today have never experienced anything else. And most of us, if we think about it at all, assume that before electric light just meant this, but more of it. Slightly less convenient. Candles instead of LEDs. Torches instead of street lamps. The same basic reality, just dimmer. The numbers tell a different story. A normally lit room sits around 300 to 500 lux. A full moon on a clear night, that romantic silver light poets have written about for centuries, gives you about 1/10 of a lux. 1/10. Already you're in a different world, but a clear, moonless night, no clouds, just stars. That's around 1,000th of a lux. And an overcast, moonless night, the kind of night that covered most of the earth for most of human history, is 1/10,000th of a lux. That's not a bit darker than your bedroom. The gap between the light in your room right now and the darkness of an ordinary pre-industrial night is roughly the same as the gap between a floodlit stadium and a single candle across the street. It's not a different setting on the same dial. It's a different world. And for all of human history until about 200 years ago, every person alive lived inside that world every night. The most common light source for ordinary people in England 300 years ago was not a candle. You might not know this because candles are what we picture when we picture the past. They're romantic, they're cinematic, they photograph well. But candles were a luxury. Beeswax candles, the ones that burned clean and clear, were almost exclusively for churches and wealthy households. Ordinary people who used tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, got something that smoked, smelled of the slaughterhouse, and melted faster than it was of any use. What ordinary people actually used was called a rushlight. You take the common bulrush, the kind that grows along ditches and riverbanks, and you strip most of its bark, leaving just the pith inside, held together by one thin green strip of outer skin so it doesn't fall apart. Then you dry it. Then you draw it slowly through a trough of leftover cooking fat. Bacon grease was considered excellent for this purpose. You let it cool and harden, and you have your rushlight. It sounds almost like a craft project. It was survival. A good rushlight, about 2.5 feet long, burned for roughly 57 minutes. Gilbert White, an English naturalist writing in 1789, calculated this himself, timing rush after rush with what you can only imagine was a particular kind of methodical sadness. 57 minutes of pale, guttering, faintly greasy light. Not enough to read by with any comfort. Enough to see the faces at the table, the hands at their work, the edges of the room. That was your evening. That was the light you ate your supper by. The light someone sewed by. The light children huddled near, telling each other things before it sputtered and went out. And when it went out, it was out. You didn't replace it. The fat was too expensive to burn more than you needed. You went to bed, or you sat in the dark and let your eyes adjust, and your eyes did adjust. Just not to anything you'd recognize. Not turn off the overhead light and your eyes are just dark. The other kind. It takes between 30 and 45 minutes for the human eye to fully adapt to real darkness. Not because your eyes get worse, because they get better in a very strange way. Your eye has two kinds of light receptors. Cones, which handle color and detail, concentrated in the center of your vision, and rods, which handle low light and motion, arranged around the edges. In true darkness, your cones essentially shut down. They're useless, your rods take over, and when they do, your eye becomes up to 1,000,000 times more sensitive to light than it is in an ordinary room. But here's what you gain and lose. You lose color. Everything becomes gray, silver, black. Every face the same pale smear. Every object reduced to its outline. You lose detail, and you lose it exactly where you most want it. The center of your vision, where your cones are clustered, becomes your worst region for seeing in the dark. A blind spot, right where you're looking. If you want to see something in very low light, a path, a face, a shape at the edge of the room, you have to look slightly to the side of it. Let it fall on the rods instead. Pre-industrial people understood this the way we understand which lane moves faster at the supermarket. Not as a fact they'd been taught, as something their bodies knew from 10,000 nights of practice. What they couldn't avoid, what no adaptation helps with, was how quiet the dark made everything else. Without sight to lean on, the other senses stretched. You heard the house settling. You heard the breathing of the person sleeping next to you change, and knew from the change whether they were truly asleep or only resting. You heard things outside that you couldn't identify, and in a world where the dark was genuinely, spiritually dangerous, the not knowing had weight. People moved through the dark with hands extended, testing the ground ahead with walking sticks. Road ditches were real dangers. Open cellar doors were real dangers. Medieval English court records show a disproportionate number of nighttime deaths. Men and women who walked into rivers, into ponds, into drainage channels they simply could not see. The darkness didn't announce itself. It was just there. And then you weren't. The wealthy had a solution of sorts. Link boys, children mostly, would carry pitch torches through the streets for hire, lighting the way for those who could afford them. In some European cities, you reportedly could hire a blind guide for the same purpose. Someone who already knew the streets by their feel, their sounds, their slight variations in ground underfoot. Someone for whom the dark was simply the default state of the world, and always had been. There's something in that detail that's hard to let go of. The people who could see hired the people who couldn't to show them the way through the dark. Now, what did people actually do in all that darkness? The easy answer, the assumed answer is, they slept. They went to bed at sundown because there was nothing else to do. And they woke when the sun came up. Darkness as absence, night as a long pause between days. That's not what happened. In rural France, in Germany, in communities across northern Europe, there was a practice during the long winter months called the veillée. As the light failed in the evening, people didn't retreat to their own homes. They gathered. One household, the largest, the warmest, usually someone with enough space and enough goodwill, would open its door, and the neighbors would come. Sometimes the farm animals were already there. A barn with cattle in it holds heat in a way a stone cottage doesn't. People brought whatever work could be done by feel and by firelight. Women spinning wool or flax, the wheel turning in the near dark, hands moving from long habit without needing to see. Men mending harness or sharpening tools, the slow scrape of a whetstone. And they talked. They told stories. Young people who were tentatively, carefully interested in each other found themselves close together in the warm dark, which is its own kind of information. The veillée was where oral tradition lived. The long stories, the old songs, the things that needed winter and firelight and an audience that wasn't going anywhere to be properly told. Think about what an audience that isn't going anywhere actually means. These weren't people who had come to be entertained in the modern sense, who could leave, or scroll, or check something else. They were there because it was cold outside and warm inside, and because the spinning had to be done either way, and because the sound of another human voice in the dark was better than the alternative. The stories had to be good enough to earn that captive attention, night after night, through the whole length of winter. The dark was the pressure that made them good. Darkness wasn't empty. It was where community happened. There's a version of this in most northern cultures, under different names, with slightly different textures. But the structure is the same. Cold outside, warm inside, dark everywhere, and humans doing what humans do when they're together with nothing else demanding their attention. Talking, spinning, telling each other things that needed to be said. The other thing people did in the dark, and this one genuinely surprises most people when they hear it, is they slept in two parts. Before artificial light, the standard pattern of human sleep across Northern Europe was not 8 uninterrupted hours. It was 2 separate blocks of sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. You had what people simply called your first sleep, beginning at dusk or shortly after, lasting somewhere around 4 hours. Then you woke, naturally, without alarm, around midnight. And for an hour or two you were simply awake, quietly awake, in the dark. What did people do with this time? If you trace through the historical record, diaries, court documents, medical literature, correspondence, a picture emerges. Some people prayed, alone in the dark, with the kind of intimacy that hour allowed. Some talked to the person next to them in a way that the darkness made easier, the way certain conversations are easier in a car at night when you're not looking at each other. Some thought, some made love. The historian Roger E. Kirch spent years collecting references to this pattern and found over 500 of them, threaded through centuries of ordinary life. What strikes you, reading through those references, is the tone of the waking. It's not anxious. People didn't describe waking in the middle of the night as a problem to be solved or a symptom to be concerned about. It was simply a known territory of the night, a quiet hour that belonged to the person who was awake in it before the second sleep pulled them back down. Then came second sleep, lasting until dawn. It wasn't a disorder. It wasn't unusual. It was simply how the human body organized its night when the night was long and unlit and there was nothing to fight against it. The 2-part sleep was the shape of human rest for most of human history, and almost no one today has heard of it. The bakers knew the night a different way. They were kneading dough before the city stirred, before first light, because bread had to be ready when people woke. Other trades claimed the night by law. In many cities, night soil men, the people tasked with emptying the cesspits and privies, were legally required to do their work only after dark. Something about containing the smell. Presumably everyone involved understood that this was the explanation being offered, and was too polite or too wise to argue. The dark had rules. Curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, cover fire. City gates locked at sundown. Church bells rang across European towns between 8 and 9 in the evening, not for prayer, but as instruction. Cover your hearth. Get indoors. The night belongs to a different jurisdiction. Anyone found walking after curfew without a lantern was, in the eyes of the law, immediately suspect. The legal term for it was night walker. And it wasn't a description. It was a charge. Something you could be arrested for. The courts treated crimes committed at night far more harshly than the same crimes by day, on the logic that anyone who would operate in darkness had already demonstrated a certain intent. The night was presumed guilty, and underneath the law, there was the older fear. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient for pre-industrial people, it was spiritually inhabited. Night was the hour of the devil, of witches moving through fields. of ghosts who had unfinished business with the living. People believed the night air itself was dangerous, that something in it could enter the body and cause illness. Folklore across Europe was dense with creatures that owned the hours between dusk and dawn. Not metaphors for people's anxieties, but genuine inhabitants of a genuine other world, as real to the people who feared them as the ditches they tried not to fall into. But the dark also sheltered. In some English towns during the darkest winter months, a church bell was rung in the evening, not as a curfew warning and not for prayer. It rang as a beacon, an auditory landmark for travellers who were lost in the countryside, who couldn't see landmarks or roads or anything at all, and who needed only to know that somewhere in the dark there was a direction to walk toward, a sound that meant, "Human settlement is here. Come this way." There's something in that practice, or in the story of that practice, so hold it gently, that feels like a whole theory of how communities related to the night. Not conquering it, not pretending it wasn't there, just putting out a sound that said, "If you're out there, we know you're out there." Around the 15th and 16th centuries, something began to shift. The wealthy started to push back against the night, not to sleep through it or fear it, but to own it. Balls lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, theatre performances that ran past dark. Coffee houses, taverns, the slow growth of a nighttime culture available to those with enough money to fuel it. Night stopped being a universal equalizer, everyone in the dark together, and became a kind of display. If your house blazed with candlelight when the neighbors were in darkness, that light meant something. Power. Cultivation. The future. This was the beginning of the end of the old night. In 1807, Pall Mall in London became the first street in the world lit by gas lamps. Within 2 decades, gaslighting had spread across Europe and North America. Within a century, electric light had reached most urban homes in the industrialized world. A way of life that had existed for all of human history, for every human who had ever lived, from the first fire builders to the last generation to no rushlight, was gone within the span of 2 or 3 generations. And with it, things disappeared that people didn't notice vanishing until much later. The segmented sleep, first sleep, waking, second sleep, fades from the historical record in an interesting way. References to first sleep appear across the literature well into the 17th century, then grow sparse, then stop. By the 19th century, the pattern had already collapsed among urban populations who now had enough light to fill their evenings. By the early 20th century, the concept had vanished so completely from Western culture that when doctors began encountering patients who woke naturally in the middle of the night and couldn't understand why, they classified it as a sleep disorder. The veillées ended, not all at once, but they thinned. When each household could light its own evening sufficiently well, the reason to gather in someone else's warm dark disappeared. The oral traditions that had lived in those gatherings, the long stories, the songs that required an audience willing to sit for them, thinned with it, not lost entirely, but moved, preserved in books, which is a different thing. The relationship humans had with darkness for most of their existence, the double sleep, the gathered warmth, the fear, the sound of a bell in the winter night, didn't end with a bang. It dissolved. Quietly, over a generation or 2, the world was lit, and the old darkness receded. And nobody held a funeral for it, because by the time it was gone, almost no one remembered it well enough to mourn. Roughly 1/3 of humanity has never seen the Milky Way. The light from our own cities has outshone it. Tonight, when you turn off the light, your eyes will start to adjust. You already know this. The door frame will come back, the wardrobe edge. The pale strip where the curtain doesn't quite close. The orange haze of the street. The green dot of the smoke detector. For a few seconds, before you reach for your phone, you'll be closer to the dark that every human before you lived in than you'll probably ever get. Not the same. You'll never see what they saw or didn't see. But the same direction. Your rods waking up, your cones going quiet. Your brain recalibrating to a world where color stops existing and edges go soft. A few seconds. Then the screen lights up and it's gone.